Representing AMD on the left-hand side of the screen, we have the ASRock 9070 XT Steel Legend up against the 5070 Ti on the right-hand side of the screen. This is the Asus Prime model. They're both at their out-of-the-box settings. And what are we looking at here? I'm going to be looking at the newest games in 2025. We'll combine it with some of my launch review data to get over 100 benchmarks today to decide on a re-review of these cards. But why do we need to re-review them? Well, let's actually talk about that for a second. The thing is, it's the pricing. So the 9070 XT was supposed to be a $600 MSRP card, but those have been out of stock since launch day, and it seems like it was heavily subsidized for launch day by AMD and has not returned to those prices. If I wanted to buy one new online right now, I'd be spending $850. I occasionally see them pop up around $750, but those go pretty quick. A 5070 Ti is meant to be around $750, but in the United States, the lowest ones I can find in stock today are $900. Honestly, finding them around $840, $850 isn't too difficult. Again, those pop up in stock. And I'm aware that worldwide pricing is different, but I'm covering the US market at this time. So it'll be important for you to interpret the performance numbers here in your market if you're looking at pricing there. Now, a lot of people always point out that, well, you can get better deals at Micro Center in person. Well, first of all, you have to be in person. You might not live near one. And I still don't see these $700 ones really in stock. And that's still $100 over MSRP. If I check the stock on that, I see it in stock in the Santa Clara Micro Center today, but every single other Micro Center is out of stock. The $720 Asus model we have here seems to be out of stock everywhere, and I have to go up to the $800 model to actually find it in stock at most locations. So it does appear like the 9070 XT is at least an $800 card most of the time because it is selling out when the lower priced ones come available, and they're really only coming in available around $700, not $600. Now, if you're looking for the best deals on PC hardware, though, you need to check out Jawa.gg. And I can make it even better by getting you $10 off your first purchase using code OWEN10. Jawa is the place where you buy, sell, and upgrade between gamers. Check this out. First of all, you can find exactly what you're looking for if you're just looking for a pre-built system. You can search by, the GPU, the CPU, performance in particular games. Honestly, for a lot of people, their PC is an art piece. It's a showcase of your room and your personality, so you can search by theme, which I think is awesome. You can get some great deals on parts, but also you can fund your upgrade. And if you're a little frustrated with high GPU prices right now, the silver lining on all of that is that your old hardware holds more of its value for sale. Now, you can set your own prices and make your own listings on Jawa. You could even make this a little business, buying and selling PC parts, or you can take maximum convenience route and just get an instant offer directly from Jawa by clicking this button, and it goes super quick. Also, you can see all the really high-rated reviews, tons of PCs for sale. Definitely check out Jawa.gg. Again, use code OWEN10 for $10 off your first purchase. And thank you to Jawa for sponsoring today's video. That makes it possible for me to do things like run absolutely insane numbers of... Guys, look at this. I think I went overboard. There's too much. Anyway, analysis of bar graphs in a minute. Let's go ahead and actually look at the side-by-side footage for these GPUs with my fat head out of the way. I'm tiny now. In the latest games of 2025. So, my favorite game of 2025 is Clair Obscur Expedition 33, so I'm going to shamelessly shill for it and say it's awesome and start out with this one. Anyway, 4K epic settings, though, are a bit rough, and they're both tied at 47 FPS. So this is a game where you will definitely be wanting to use some kind of upscaling or reduced settings. And this is my main hang-up on the 9070 XT. FSR 4 is awesome. It's almost as good as DLSS 4, and it's competitive with or even a little better than DLSS 3. However, it's not available in as many games. This is a game that only has DLSS, XeSS, and TSR available for upscaling. The best option here for AMD is XeSS, but it just doesn't look as good as DLSS does here at the performance mode. So the 5070 Ti is now 6% faster, which, oh well, whatever, but it looks better. If you look at things like the steps here, the arm swinging in motion, the tree, look at the leaves in the background on those distant trees, pinch to zoom on your phone, it's just a bit sharper on the right-hand side of the screen. Now you could try to mod in FSR 4 support to games that don't have it, but for me, that's my biggest concern about the 9070 XT. XT right now. Is that FSR 4 is good, but I would like it to be available in every single game, at least every new game, and it just isn't yet. Although it is available in a lot. We'll see that most of the games I tested from 2025 did have it available. Now, if we go down to 4K medium settings, you could play at native 4K resolution on both GPUs just fine. We're at 75 FPS and 74 FPS respectively. But if you do use upscaling, we can now hit 96 and 109 FPS, the 5070 taking a 14% advantage now, and an image quality advantage. Once again, looking at the fine details in the background, I think the tree branches in the background are a good place to see it. Again, if you're on a smaller or lower res screen, the pinch to zoom on phones can do it, that kind of thing. Anyway, at 1440p epic settings, though, you are going to be able to play at about 60 FPS on both GPUs. Yes, there are places in the game where you'll dip below that. But if you go ahead and use... wait a second. I just pushed the wrong button. What did I just press, guys? I jumped to the wrong spot in my benchmarks. I meant to jump ahead. There we go. If we use XeSS and DLSS... ooh, typo. Move my fat head in the way. That's DLSS balanced, guys. And I had to set XeSS to the 58%. I'm not using their naming schemes because the XeSS naming schemes are different than the DLSS and AMD naming schemes. I'm matching the internal rendering resolution. Anyway, so here's an example where they're both getting around 90 FPS, but once again, it's going to look a little bit better on the right-hand side of the screen due to the DLSS advantage over the AMD version of XeSS, well, not AMD version of XeSS, but the version of XeSS that runs on AMD hardware. For those of you who don't know, if you have Intel GPUs, they have their own version of XeSS that looks better than the one that you can run on other GPUs. At 1440p medium settings, we're getting 94 and 92 respectively, so you really don't need upscaling if you just drop to medium settings. And by the way, this game still looks quite great at medium settings. I played most of it on a lower end GPU using medium settings. So anyway, if we use DLSS balanced and set XeSS to the same internal rendering resolution, we are, man, guys, I'm apologies, typos right here. Frame rate's up here, 133, 130. They're basically getting the same performance. It's over 130 FPS, but once again, we have the issue of the image quality being better with DLSS. All right, I'm out of the way again now. Sorry for the typos. Now we're looking at 1080p max settings, and we're at 83 and 79 FPS respectively. 5% lead for the 9070 XT, 1% lower, 16% lead though. And at medium settings, we're at a 4% advantage for the 9070 XT at 125 FPS versus 120. By the way, this is my plan for all of the 2025 games. We're going to test at max settings and medium settings at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p. And at 4K, we'll also try native as well as performance mode upscaling. And at 1440p, we'll do native as well as balanced mode upscaling. And at 1080p, we'll just do native. Anyway. At Monster, biggest selling game of the year, right? Monster Hunter Wilds. 4K max settings, this is ultra with ray tracing high, so totally maxed out including ray tracing. Well, despite ray tracing being enabled here, the 9070 XT does have the lead, albeit only by 5% and 2 FPS, and honestly it's 46 FPS versus 44, so these probably aren't the settings you're going to use on either GPU. And honestly, it's not the heaviest ray tracing workload either, but if we do kick on FSR and DLSS at the performance mode, and now we do have FSR 4 available, so now both sides of the screen look good. We're at 69 versus, versus 67, 3% lead for the 9070 XT, so it's, again, basically a tie here. And both are getting a good experience, so you can definitely play this game maxed out if you're using some upscaling on these GPUs. 4K medium settings, we're now at 57 versus 53 FPS, so notice with ray tracing turned off, the 9070 XT's lead grows to 8%. If we kick upscaling on at the performance mode, we're getting 83 and 80 respectively, 4% lead for the 9070 XT. And if we drop down to 1440p, but max settings again, ultra with RT at the high settings, now the 9070 XT is winning by 12%, despite this being ray tracing involved. Although again, this is not super heavy duty ray tracing in this game. Good experience on both GPUs here, even without upscaling, but if we do go ahead and kick on balanced mode upscaling, we're at 90 versus 82, so 10% lead for the 9070 XT. And at 1440p medium settings, you can get 91 versus 77, which is an 18% advantage for the 9070 XT, despite, and again, I think the lead has climbed both at the lower rendering resolution and by turning ray tracing off. I think that's what we're seeing here. Using DLSS and FSR at the balanced settings, we're now at 111 versus 97, so 14% advantage for the 9070 XT, but a good experience on both, of course. And at 1080p max settings with RT high, the 9070 XT is winning by 15% at 90 versus 78. And at medium settings 1080p, we're now leading by 20% at 112 versus 93. So it seems like in Monster Hunter Wilds, AMD does have the edge here, and as the resolution decreases, the lead increases, and as ray tracing is turned off, lead increases as well. But one of the other best-selling games of the year is Oblivion Remastered, and this game is brutal on its maximum settings. Ultra settings with hardware RT Lumen to its ultra settings, so this is hardware ray tracing involved here, but both GPUs are tied at 34. If we go ahead and kick on FSR and DLSS at the performance mode, and we do have FSR 4 available here, so both sides of the screen are looking pretty good. We're at 61 versus 63, so basically a tie, but notice in the 1% lows, AMD is 15% ahead, and keep your eye on that throughout Oblivion Remastered. The frame time graphs are just smoother on AMD in this game. 4K medium settings, and I've turned off hardware RT and set it to software Lumen at low. We're now seeing 4% lead for the 9070 XT at 56 versus 54, but look at the frame time graphs, much spikier on the right-hand side. The 9070 XT is winning by 41% in the 1% lows at 48 versus 34. Both GPUs will stutter at times because this game just stutters at times, but much more of the micro stutter is eliminated on the AMD side for whatever reason. At medium settings with FSR and DLSS at the performance mode at 4K output, we're seeing the 5070 Ti 7% ahead in the averages at 115 versus 107, but once again, more spikes on the frame time graph, and the 9070 XT is leading by 26% in the 1% lows. 1440p max settings, including the hardware RT turned back on to its max setting, the 9070 XT is 4% ahead at 56 versus 54, but 14% ahead in the 1% lows at 41 versus 36. At 1440p max settings, but using FSR and DLSS balanced, we're getting 82 versus 81, so basically a tie, but a 24% lead in the 1% lows for AMD. At 1440p medium settings with the hardware RT turned off, it's a 42% lead in the 1% lows for AMD here, despite them being about tied at 105 and 100, so 5% lead in the averages. Again, looking at the frame time graphs, it's just a lot smoother on the left-hand side of the screen. 1440p medium with DLSS and FSR balanced. Oh my goodness, another typo. So don't look at this, look at these. It's like 150 FPS on both. But again, the 1% lows are a lot better for AMD right there. Apologies for the typo. It's not really a typo, it's just that I must have just not typed in those on that one for some reason. No idea why. Anyway, I do type those in all manually. All right, 1080p max settings, hardware RT on. The 9070 XT is ahead by 5 FPS and 7% at 75 versus 70, but 27% better in the 1% lows at 56 versus 44. Again, just looking at the frame time graphs, it does just look smoother on the left. At 1080p medium settings, software Lumen, we're at 148 versus 141, so 5% lead for the 9070 XT, but 27% lead in the 1% lows at 109 versus 86, and just a generally flatter frame time graph. What about Doom the Dark Ages, which requires ray tracing? At max settings, it's 49 versus 53, 8% lead for the 5070 Ti, but you'd probably want to kick on some upscaling, which we're doing here. FSR and DLSS is performance mode, but this game does not support FSR 4, and I looked into it. That's because it does not have Vulkan support for FSR 4. We need Vulkan support because it does look better on the right-hand side, although this being a dark game, it's probably macro blocking a lot for the compression on YouTube, so you might not see it, but there's more detail on the right-hand side of the screen, even though performance is pretty similar at 98 and 94, respectively. By the way, just a side note, the maximum settings in this game do not have path tracing yet as of the time of filming. This game has announced they're planning a path tracing update, but is not released as of the time of filming. Anyway, 5070 Ti, we're at, at 4K medium settings, we're at 58 versus 55. Again, this is still using ray tracing. This game does always use ray tracing. 5% lead for the 5070 Ti, but 12% lead in the 1% lows. At 1440p maximum settings, we're at 91 versus 89. So 2% lead for the 5070 Ti, so it's basically tied here. At 1440p max, but with DLSS and FSR balance, we're at 137 FPS versus 124, 10% lead for the 9070 XT, but again, it was an image quality lead due to the older version of FSR. 1440p medium settings, basically a tie at 101 versus 99, and if you use FSR and DLSS balanced, the AMD card is 18% faster, but it looks better on the right-hand side of the screen, so not quite an apples-to-apples comparison there. 1080p maximum settings, we're at 124 versus 120. So again, basically tied and pretty high frame rates on both. And 1080p medium, it's 143 versus 132, 8% advantage for the 9070 XT. Marvel's Spider-Man 2, let me actually go back here for a second. I need to talk because have you noticed that in a lot of these games, AMD tends to use a little more VRAM than NVIDIA? NVIDIA in this game is pushed up right almost to 16 gigabytes. AMD is spilling over it. You'll notice system RAM. System RAM is more full here. Wait, I actually need to move this down to show system RAM. There we go. System RAM is more full on AMD, and AMD's performance is crushed. This is a game that's using more than 16 gigabytes of VRAM on the AMD hardware and staying just under it on the NVIDIA hardware, or it's just handling the spillover a little bit more gracefully. Either way, that's what's going on here. Not great performance there anyway, though, but if you do kick on FSR and DLSS at the performance mode, and by the way, it is FSR 4 and DLSS 4 available in this game, so it looks good on both sides, but NVIDIA is able to get just under the VRAM usage here, leading to a 78% lead. At 73 FPS, it's very usable now, whereas AMD is still using more system RAM than not. See what's going on, right? There's still that spillover. So this is one of those edge cases where we're right on that VRAM borderline, and NVIDIA being a little more efficient on VRAM usage is making all the difference. It's not AMD actually being worse at ray tracing in this game, which we'll actually see when we test the lower resolutions. But first, let's look at 4K medium settings and turn ray tracing off. Now we're seeing 74 FPS versus 73, so basically a tie and a decent frame rate on both. And if we kick on FSR 4 and DLSS 4, it's a high frame rate experience on both. 130 versus 146. It is a 12% lead here for the 5070 Ti. I've noticed sometimes it feels like FSR 4 might be a bit of a heavier algorithm, so sometimes the 5070 Ti gains a bit more performance than the 9070 XT does from it. But again, both having a good experience there for sure. At 1440p max settings, including the maxed out ray tracing, notice that AMD actually does keep up just fine. It's 64 FPS versus 63, so only a 1 FPS advantage for the 5070 Ti. It's basically a tie. So really, again, at those 4K max settings, it was a VRAM issue, not a ray tracing issue for AMD, and this is further evidence. Notice once again that the system RAM is now even between the two cards. Kicking on, sorry, let me go back for a second here. So what if we go ahead and kick on upscaling? So DLSS and FSR balanced on the maximum settings at 1440p. We're getting 91 and 101 FPS respectively. So now the 5070 Ti is 11% faster, but both GPUs getting a nice high frame rate experience here. So these cards are capable of the maximum settings in this game at 1440p, whereas at 4K, there was more of that spilling over VRAM issue, at least on the AMD side. At 1440p medium settings, 132 FPS versus 130, so it's basically tied in its high FPS experience on both. And then we can go ahead and kick on DLSS and FSR balanced. Now the 5070 Ti is 7% faster at 193 versus 181. At 1080p max settings, again with ray tracing maxed out, the 5070 Ti is faster, but only by 7% at 88 versus 82, and good experience on both GPUs. At 1080p medium settings, it's basically a tie, 179 versus 177. You will not notice the difference without a frame time graph, or a frame rate counter, sorry, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Now, what about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, another one of my favorite games of the year? And while it is quite well optimized, its maximum settings are extremely brutal. The 4K experimental settings, we're only getting 42 FPS on the 5070 Ti and only 31 on the 9070 XT. This one does not appear to be a VRAM issue. This just runs a lot faster on NVIDIA hardware. 35% faster in this case, and if we go to FSR and DLSS at the performance mode, once again, we do have FSR 4 and DLSS 4 available in this game. Now, while the image quality looks good on both sides of the screen, the 5070 Ti is 49% faster, and it is hitting 61 FPS versus 41. I've had some people tell me don't even bother testing experimental settings in this game, and honestly, I'm really just sticking to max settings and medium settings to keep things simple. Also, notice the 5070 Ti is usable here. It is averaging 61 FPS. It's probably still not optimal. It'd probably still be a good idea to turn down settings a bit for a lot more performance. Speaking of which, let's go to medium. So if we go to 4K medium, we're now looking at 78 versus 89 FPS with the 5070 Ti 14% ahead. So this is just a game that favors NVIDIA hardware, at least looks like when we're looking at 90 series versus 50 series. If we go ahead and kick on FSR 4 and DLSS 4 at the performance mode, we're now seeing an 18% lead for the 5070 Ti, but both GPUs are hitting high frame rates, 149 versus 126. So yeah, it's definitely noticeably faster on NVIDIA, but you're still having a very good experience on the 9070 XT. 1440p experimental settings, 5070 Ti is taking a 50% lead. So yeah, whatever's going on with these experimental settings definitely favors the 50 series hardware here, and it is hitting 63 FPS, so it is usable, whereas AMD is only hitting 42. If we go ahead and kick on balanced mode upscaling for both, the 5070 Ti climbs to 74 FPS average, putting it 54% ahead of the 9070 XT, which is only hitting 48 despite using upscaling. I've noticed whatever's going on with these experimental settings, it doesn't respond super well to upscaling. You gain a bit of performance, but not much. At 1440p medium settings, though, we're now seeing 169 nice versus 142. It's a 19% advantage for the 5070 Ti, but you're at a very high refresh rate on both GPUs. Kicking on FSR and DLSS balanced mode, we're now at 222 FPS versus 189, 17% lead for the 5070 Ti. If we go ahead and jump down to 1080p resolution, experimental settings at 75 FPS for the 5070 Ti, so it is usable here, 53% advantage over the 49 FPS on the 9070 XT. At 1080p medium settings, though, we're at 234 FPS versus 196, 19% advantage for the 5070 Ti. So high refresh rates on both, but this game is definitely doing better on the 5070 Ti. What about Assassin's Creed Shadows? This is one of the top sellers this year by the lists I've looked at, and well, it is very demanding at its maximum settings. Ultra high settings with the maxed out RT settings is only 34 FPS on both GPUs, albeit that's at 4K native resolution. Now, luckily this is a game where we do have FSR 4 available, and so it's looking pretty good. If you do look at the fine details like those little patterns overhanging the awnings here, I do think you're getting a little more detail in it on like the DLSS image, but again, it's looking very, very usable here for AMD. FSR 4 is extremely competitive and very usable. And performance-wise here, despite the ray tracing being at its max settings in the game, we are seeing the 5070 Ti only ahead by 1 FPS, 2%, 57 versus 56, and both are very usable here in the performance mode at the maximum settings. Remember that if you're around 60 FPS, you can also kick on frame gen if you like. Anyway, 4K medium RT hideout only, which basically means RT off unless you're in the hideout, and I don't think this is the hideout, I don't think. Anyway, I don't actually play this game, guys, sorry. Anyway, 4K medium RT hideout only, so I think this is RT off, which might explain why AMD's performance jumped ahead relatively. Now 13% lead for 9070 XT at 71 versus 63, and that's at native 4K. If you kick on FSR and DLSS at the performance mode, we're now seeing it's basically going down to a tie. This is one of the cases where I think FSR 4 is a little bit of a heavier algorithm, but now it's 101 FPS versus 102, so it's pretty much a tie, and they're both a nice high frame rate for a single-player game. If we switch down to 1440p at max settings, including maxed out ray tracing, it's a 9070 XT lead at 52 versus 49, despite RT being enabled here, 6% advantage, so it's basically a tie, but it's technically a little bit of a lead for the 9070 XT. And if we kick on FSR and DLSS balanced, the lead drops to 3%, so again, still basically a tie, but we're now over 60 FPS on both GPUs, 66 versus 64. If we go ahead and go to medium settings and turn off ray tracing as much as possible, we're now at 102 FPS versus 92, which is an 11% advantage for the 9070 XT. And if we kick on 1080p resolution, 1080p resolution max settings, we're at 63 versus 58, 9% lead for the 9070 XT. And if we go to medium settings at 1080p with the RT turned off as much as possible, it's at 11% advantage for the 9070 XT at 120 FPS versus 108. And now the last game I tested here is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at 4K max settings, which is called high in this game. The 5070 Ti takes a bit of a lead, 7% in the averages at 77 versus 72, 17% in the 1% lows. Now, both GPUs are capable of a native 4K in this game. That being said, AMD is at a massive disadvantage if you use upscaling. Because there's no FSR or XeSS available in this game. There's only TAAU if you don't have DLSS. And TAAU looks pretty bad here. Like, let me jump back a little bit so you can watch more of this. If you look around Cloud as he's running, especially as corners turn, like you'll see a lot of shimmery disocclusion artifacts, lots of other stuff in motion. Like, there's a big image quality advantage here on the right-hand side of the screen. And again, that's just a shame. And unfortunately, this is just kind of the case in some games, is that AMD just seems to be more of an afterthought. It's less so than it used to be, and we saw FSR 4 available in a lot of games. But this is kind of, again, I think the biggest disadvantage for the 9070 XT is just the availability of FSR versus the availability of DLSS. Also, I'm not going to test this game at any lower settings because then you start running into the 120 FPS frame rate cap, so there it is. All right, guys, we just saw a ton of stuff. Now let's get into some bar graphs. Yay! I tested a lot of stuff. So what is this? This is all of the tests that I just showed you side-by-side footage for. And this is, well, let me explain this chart just to make sure everybody understands it. So this is not a frame rate, this is a percentage advantage. This is also a percentage advantage. I have assigned the negative direction to be at a percentage advantage for AMD if the 9070 XT had the lead, and I've assigned the percentage advantage in the positive direction to be if the 5070 Ti had a lead. So if anything shows a 0, that doesn't mean they got 0 FPS, that means there was a 0% advantage for either GPU. So this is the middle line. Anything to the right of this is a win for the 5070 Ti. Anything to the left of this is a win for the 9070 XT. As you can see here, this matters a lot which game you're playing and at what settings. In general, the biggest leads for the 5070 Ti was here. But you know what? It might be easier to interpret this if we sort it like this. So I've now sorted it as the biggest leads for the 5070 Ti on top and the biggest leads for the 9070 XT on the bottom. You can see ties right here at 0. So this is a good way of looking at it, because then you can look at both how big are the advantages or disadvantages, if you want to look at it that way, but also how many wins are there for each. You can see that while the 9070 XT technically has a few more wins, that's a technicality if we're talking 1 or 2%, right? So really, each of them wins about as much as it loses, but when the 5070 Ti wins, it had a tendency to, well, it had more cases where it was by a wide margin. Although most of these are the experimental settings in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which most people wouldn't use. And then the biggest lead right here is when the AMD card ran out of VRAM. Because again, it does seem like NVIDIA is more efficient on VRAM usage. So even though both cards have 16 gigabytes of VRAM, when you're right at that 16 gigabyte limit, the 5070 Ti stayed under it, the 9070 XT went over it. And so in Spiderman 2 at 4K max settings, that mattered. And it gave a very playable experience on the 5070 Ti, but not on the AMD hardware. That being said, you could adjust settings to try to stay within that VRAM buffer, but that is something to keep in mind. It is an advantage for the 5070 Ti. Now, one thing of note here is that I don't see any clear sign that NVIDIA was having a big ray tracing advantage in general. It did win in some ray tracing situations, but AMD won in a lot of ray tracing situations as well. But one thing to note is that I was just testing the biggest releases of 2025, and none of them had a path tracing implementation. And I think that's representative, because honestly, there's just not a ton of games with path tracing. However, Doom the Dark Ages is supposed to get one, it's just not available at this time. So if we go back to some of my older testing, like for my launch review, then we can I can confirm that in games with path tracing like Cyberpunk, Alan Wake 2, Black Myth Wukong, things like that, you will see a large advantage for the 5070 Ti. And the 5070 Ti is strong enough to use path tracing, especially if you're on a 1440p display and you use DLSS balanced or quality mode, which looks pretty good with the DLSS 4 model. So I will say that while in normal ray tracing workloads, especially ones that are designed with consoles in mind, I think the 90 series has pretty much caught up. Like the 9070 XT ray traces absolutely fine in any sort of ray tracing that is designed around console targets. However, these NVIDIA-sponsored path tracing updates can look really good. There's not a lot of them, but they can look really good, and if you want to use one, like in Cyberpunk, it is transformative. I did play the game with it, and it is awesome. And it's just gonna be a much better experience on the 5070 Ti. So there is that advantage. Other differences I didn't get into are things like frame generation. Both have frame generation, but DLSS frame generation does have a ×4 mode and a ×3 mode, whereas FSR currently has a ×2 mode. Honestly, my take on that is unless you have a 240 hertz display, ×2 mode's probably enough, because I recommend kicking on frame generation when you're at about 60 FPS anyway. And 60 ×2, there's a little bit of overhead, so it's not really a doubling, but it gets you over 100 FPS. And it should really only be used in single-player titles, in my opinion, anyway, because it does have a latency penalty. Basically, if you have somewhere between a 100 and 165 hertz monitor, the ×2 mode's pretty much all you need. Whereas if you have a 240 hertz monitor, well, then your ×3 and ×4 mode can potentially be more useful, but it's not really performance, it's just really some more additional motion smoothing in games where you want to use it. at a little bit of a cost to image quality and latency. Anyway, that being said, though, these are all the games from 2025 that I just tested, but what if we actually combine it with my launch review? Because launch wasn't that long ago. These are still pretty fresh benchmarks. Check this out, guys. This is 111 benchmarks between the 5070 Ti and the 9070 XT. Anyway, if we jump back to just the 2025 ones that I did, we're seeing that the 5070 Ti is on average 3% faster. That's another way of looking at this. In other words, it's basically a tie on average, and as you can see, depending on the game, one might have a lead or the other might have a lead. Even in ray tracing titles, it can really go either way, unless it's a big path tracing title. So there's that. If I combine these results with my launch review, we now, like I said, have over 111 results if I counted correctly, and now that puts the 5070 Ti 4.5% faster. This is including the path tracing results as well, by the way. Now, I am using the geometric mean, the geo mean, which is more resistance to outliers than things like the arithmetic mean. I do think that's the better way to represent what's happening here. But anyway, so long story short, I would say that the 5070 Ti is a bit of a better graphics card. So if they cost about the same, I do think the 5070 Ti is the choice you should make. They have the same amount of VRAM. They have roughly the same performance. The 5070 Ti is a few percent faster. It's nothing to write home about. I really think that the bigger difference between the two is the feature set differences. And AMD has been doing a great job of closing the feature set gap with NVIDIA, but has not completely closed it. They've gotten much closer, but they have not completely closed it. The DLSS 4 is still slightly better looking than FSR 4. And the bigger difference is that DLSS is available in more games. And even DLSS 3 is fairly competitive with FSR 4 image quality-wise, even if FSR 4 might have a little bit of an edge there. And if you look at the games that have either DLSS 3 or DLSS 4 support combined, up against the games that have FSR 4 support, since FSR 3 is really not competitive with them from an image quality standpoint, I would say as a gamer, that would be the biggest concern for me. So that would be my biggest thing where if these cost the same, that's why I would buy the 5070 Ti instead. Again, they have the same amount of VRAM, so it's not one of those AMD versus NVIDIA things where you get a lot more VRAM from AMD, that kind of thing. We just don't have that here. So really, there's nothing about the 9070 XT that is really better than a 5070 Ti, but it's extremely competitive with the 5070 Ti. So there's that. Now, like I said, at current pricing, that's why we're doing kind of this re-review. At current pricing, where if I was going to buy one online today, the best deal I could get on a 9070 XT is $850. Again, I know in other regions this could be different. And if I'd spend $900 to get a 5070 Ti today, personally, I'd say $50 difference when I'm spending $850 to $900. I'd spend the extra $50 on the 5070 Ti. But if you're buying in a location where that is not true, if the difference starts going over $100 different, I'd probably save the money and get the 9070 XT personally, because it is extremely competitive. Again, slightly faster on the 5070 Ti. You will get access to path tracing. For me, the biggest thing is the DLSS availability. FSR 4 is extremely competitive, but it is more available on the DLSS. So that's where I'm at with things. Again, though, honestly, GPU pricing not looking great. So don't forget to check out jawa.gg to buy, sell, and upgrade between gamers. Remember that I can get you that $10 off using code OWEN10 using the link in the video description and/or pinned comment. And again, if you're upset about these high GPU prices, selling your GPU to fund your upgrade is the best way to handle that. And again, huge thank you to them sponsoring today's video. If you're looking for other huge GPU comparisons, stay tuned to the channel. I hope all of you have an excellent day.